Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. It's been more than 2.5 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and despite heavy fighting, Russia still occupies 18% of Ukraine's territory. Ukraine's counteroffensive efforts have stalled, and Russia has launched new offensives in Ukraine's northeast Kharkiv region. I think it's fair to say that the situation in Ukraine is pretty dire. Fighting and airstrikes have inflicted over 30,000 civilian casualties, and 3.7 million people are internally displaced, and 6.5 million have fled Ukraine. More than 14 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. To give us an assessment of what's going on the ground in Ukraine, we're joined today by award-winning journalist Moritz Gatman. For 2 decades, his focus has been on countries in the post-Soviet space, and he's reported extensively from Ukraine for Stern, Spiegel magazine, and other news outlets. In 2014, he was a witness to the bloody Maidan uprising and reported on the war in eastern Ukraine. And since February of 2022, he's covered the war in Ukraine extensively. Moritz, herzlich willkommen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation because I think it's important for people to gain insight into what's actually going on the ground. And you just came back from a reporting trip to Ukraine and had a piece in Stern with the title Die Lage in der Ukraine ist ernst. Wir brauchen endlich mehr Realismus. Roughly translated, the situation in Ukraine is serious. We need to be realistic, or we need more realism. I thought we could maybe start our conversation by hearing from you about the current situation in Ukraine at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say that the situation at the moment is, or the atmosphere is not as depressed as it was by the end of last year, 23, because back then, at the beginning of 23, there was a lot of optimism. Ukraine, half of the Ukrainians thought that the war would end in 23. There was a lot of hope with this counter-offensive in the summer. And so by the end of last year, I really remember it. You could feel it nearly physically. By the end of last year, Ukrainians were depressed because they understood that the war wouldn't end, that this counter-offensive brought only thousands of dead soldiers, but no real advantage on the battlefield. And so that was the situation last winter. And now people are not as depressed maybe as last winter. If you go to cities like Kiev or wherever, you see a rather vibrant life. You have concerts, you have like quite a normal life in many cities of Ukraine. But people are, I would say, people are tired, people are exhausted. People want peace. Mm-hmm. And this is much stronger than last year. Also, if you look at the opinion surveys, the readiness of Ukrainians for some kind of compromise is much higher now than it was last year, in order to achieve a stable peace.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's a great starting point. You've touched on a couple of different things. I'd like to come back to sort of the readiness for compromise in just a minute. But first, I'd like to pick up on something you just mentioned and that you wrote about. You said that in Kyiv, it's not, life is normal, but life is closer to normal. And of course, as you get closer to the front lines, life is less normal. But in your article, you also almost talked about a two-class system, right? Those people who are able to be in Kyiv and enjoy some of the concerts that you're talking about are living in a very different reality from those who are actually fighting on the front lines. And you made that stark distinction in your article.
Mhm. Yeah, of course, this contrast between the people fighting on the front line and between the civilian population is getting tougher and tougher. And also, I would say the conflict, because you meet people at the front line who have been fighting for two and a half years. And I mean, I just remember, for example, I met with this sniper who was a commander of a sniper unit, and he has seen most of his soldiers dying. He was like a real, like Sylvester Stallone Rambo guy, sitting next to me with all his guns and knives and everything. And during our conversation, he started to cry at one point. And this is very telling, I would say, that people like this guy start to cry. You can be in this condition of war, of tough fighting for 1 year, for 2 years, but at one point you just break. So what these guys, I remember conversations like these also from the end of last year, what these frontline soldiers were saying is that they needed rotation, that that they are too tired at this moment and they need rotation. But the problem is that the mobilization is not going as it was expected. And this leads to a situation where these people can't be rotated. They can't have enough time to relax and then maybe get back to the front line, or of those people becoming, I don't know, getting to other positions in the army to train others. No, everybody is needed on the front line, and you get like maximum 5 days off, and then you have to go back to the front line. And of course, this leads to exhaustion on the one hand, and also to more conflicts, because the people on the front line have the feeling that they uh, that it's unjust. And besides that, unfortunately, you constantly see in Ukrainian media stories about corruption in these, like doctors and people who are in charge of, like who can decide if someone has to go to the army or not. There are these stories where they arrest these people with $1 million, and they're all over the place. So you may understand what this does with the morale of the soldiers.
I mean, of course. And I think you just touched on something, again, that you also mentioned in the article about just not having enough people, right? And that's obviously what happens in a war of attrition, which is what is playing out in Ukraine right now. This is very much a war of attrition, where it seems as if Russia has more resources that it can throw at the war than Ukraine does.
I mean, this is mathematics.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
mathematics. I talked about this last year already, but people wouldn't listen to me. Sorry to say this. I mean, Russia has 145 million people. And still up to now, for many people in Russian villages, small towns, a guy who's 40 or 45 years old, the money that he gets for this job to fight in Ukraine, when he's weighing up like the risk and the money that he will get, many still decide, there are enough people who decide to go. And in Ukraine, you have now maybe 28, 29 million people. And the big difference, if you compare it to 22, to the beginning of the war, is that like in February 22, you had Russian tanks rolling into the country from the north, from the east, and from the south. So
Mhm.
everybody had this feeling of threat, and the people were taking to the were going to the army, and they understood that they have to fight because it was a war of it was an existential threat. But now you don't have the situation anymore. The war is mainly going on somewhere in the east, in some, not totally, but you can compare it a little bit with the situation in 2014, 2015,
Mhm.
when the war in Ukraine also became something that is happening in the east. But for the rest of the country, it was quite easy to sort of forget about it.
Mhm.
And so in and now in Ukraine, you have the same situation, I would say. I talked to a member of parliament who is a former soldier in Kiev, Kostenko. He's saying that the government needs to mobilize the whole country because this is a like you need a total war. This is a
Mhm.
war, an existential threat. But at this moment, Ukrainian society is not ready to like to stand up against the threats like they did in 22.
Mhm. So, I mean, let's maybe talk a little bit more about that. You know, you've talked a bit about the morale of the Ukrainian people, in general, and that it's maybe a little different in different places, right? In big cities in Kiev, it's pretty good right now. Obviously, on the front line, it's not. You also talked a little bit about how the mindset has changed since the war broke out in 2022, where everybody felt under attack. And now for many people, it feels like the war is further away. It's not imminent. They're not as concerned about it. Can you talk a little bit about how the morale has evolved or changed in Ukraine over the last year or so?
Mhm. Well, over the last year, I would say Ukrainians have become more realistic about the outcome of this war.
Mhm.
If in 23, for a long time, many still believed in a Ukrainian victory, and many also believed that it would be possible to retake uh, some of the territory, at least, that was occupied by Russia. Uh, in this year, also, if you look at the opinion polls, Ukrainians come to believe, come to understand, come to an understanding that in the near future, maybe this is not possible. The retaking of Donetsk or Crimea or whatever, and have come to an understanding that like defeating Russia is not under the circumstances that we have now, taking into account the support from the West, it's not possible to defeat Russia. Maybe it was
Mhm.
possible in 22. Many say this, that in
Mhm.
22 there was a window of opportunity in the autumn of 22. But now many understand that it's, yeah, again, like taking into account the fact that the West is not going all in,
Mhm. Yeah.
and taking into account that uh, the war in Ukraine is not an isolated war. It's a part of the broader war theater in the world, where you have the Middle East, uh, I don't know, the war in Israel, the Houthis, whatever. And I mean, and Ukrainians understand that countries like Germany or the US, they are weighing up advantages or disadvantages of certain decisions. So
Mhm.
the US is, why isn't the US giving long-range missiles to the Ukrainians so they can strike Russia?
Yeah.
I couldn't understand this for quite a long time, but now uh, I sort of uh, I sort of understand it, that it's also connected to other conflicts in the world. the Americans understand for maybe that the Russians, as an answer, could give certain missiles to the Houthi rebels, and the Houthi rebels could attack American warships in the Gulf of Aden.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, and I think in Ukraine over this year, people have come to a certain understanding of this. While in the last year they were still believing that like the West is standing behind Ukraine and more of the other countries of the world. But what we see, it's also connected with the war in Israel, that
Yeah.
there are conflicts in the West, and there are even bigger conflicts between the West and many big players in the world, as India or South Africa, Brazil, whoever, China.
And I would think when considering the morale of people in Ukraine, there has to be a sense of wishing that there was more support from the West, right? And recognizing that that support is not coming. And that sort of leads to another question that I have, and you've touched on this a little bit, you know, some of the what are some of the challenges facing Ukraine as it tries to push back Russian forces? Obviously, limitations in terms of the boots on the ground, in terms of the equipment that they have and the weapons that they have. But can you talk a little bit about where you see the main challenges in Ukraine launching a strong and successful counteroffensive?
I would say that the main challenge is really personal,
Mm-hmm.
because as I talked to this like this member of parliament Kostenko, I asked him also about this. He I mean, he has a lot of personal experience in the military, and he knows what's going on at the moment. He was saying that Ukraine is basically forming 14 new brigades over the last 6 months, maybe. But what is happening in reality is that they are taking people from these brigades and putting them into the existing brigades, because you just need them at the front line at the moment. So in order to launch a counteroffensive, you would need 14 well-equipped, fresh brigades. But I don't see them at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because many people who should be in these brigades, who should be trained, instead they are taken to the front line in Donbass to fight. And I don't see at the moment that Ukrainians can start a counteroffensive. The question right now, I don't know if you were following the news over the last 1 or 2 weeks. The question now at the moment is how to stabilize the front line, because the Ukrainians are really losing ground there. Every day, a village, or yeah, every day.
Well, and related to that, you know, in terms of the personnel and basically the fact that Ukraine does not have a strong enough fighting force, what do you make of these reports about North Korean soldiers being in Russia to help with the Russian war effort?
Well, some say that this is a sign of weakness of Russia, that Russia is like running out of soldiers, and that's why they have to draw North Korean soldiers to the war. But I don't really see this as a sign of weakness. It's I mean, of of course, it would be better if they could do without these North Korean soldiers. But what they are showing to the world is that they have reserves, that they, even if they run out of their own soldiers, they have partners like North Korea who can help them solve these problems. And Ukrainians don't have this possibility. So is it really a sign of weakness?
Yeah.
And even from a legal point of view, by the way, Russia is allowed to do this because they are deployed on the territory of Russia. It's an incursion by Ukraine on Russian territory. So from a legal point of view, it's not really it's not a problem. So
Yeah.
in this case, I don't see a real sign of weakness.
Yeah, not at all. If anything, it's an indication of sort of how deep the Russian reserves are, that they're able to draw on these soldiers as well. But it sounds as if it might be bringing South Korea into the mix as well in terms of providing some weapons and some munitions. One of our viewers is curious about, and this might be outside of sort of your purview a little bit, but one of our viewers is curious what your thoughts are on the impact of the war in Ukraine on the food and energy markets in particular Europe, but also the rest of the world. Sort of how much of an impact this conflict is having on food security and energy security writ large.
Hmm. I mean, concerning food security, it was an issue in 22 when Russia was basically blocking exports of grain from Ukraine, because Ukraine is one of the most important producers of grain. But I mean, since 23, Ukraine is basically exporting again, and they are producing a lot of agricultural products. So I don't see a threat in this particular field anymore. It was in 22, yes, but no, not anymore. Concerning energy, I would say, and of course, it was a big problem for Germany in 22.
Right.
Because Germany was very, very dependent on Russian gas, also oil, but mainly on gas. And but somehow, I mean, you see for Germany, you still see the problems. The energy prices are very high because Germany had to find other sources of gas, especially which are more expensive than the cheap gas from Russia. So until now, you see the consequences of this for Germany. You see the German economy in trouble, not only because of this war, but also because of this war.
But also, yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that mainly the world has adapted to this situation. Russia is exporting much more gas via LNG at the moment than they did in 22. By the way, also to Europe. So Europe isn't buying Russian gas through the pipelines anymore, but via LNG, which is a bit ironical also, but yeah. So yeah, I would say that at this point, the world has mainly adapted to the new realities.
In your opening comments, you said that the sort of Fingerspitzengefühl, the pulse that you picked up on, is that people in Ukraine are maybe a little bit more open to compromise, and that they want peace. And yet, in the article that you wrote, you said that a peace agreement is probably in the distant future. And you also wrote about it being sort of a just peace is what the goal or what the objective would be. As somebody who has a deep knowledge of the region and of the country, do you think a truce and a peace agreement is something that we can expect anytime soon? And what would that look like?
I don't think that we'll see a peace agreement in the near future. But we haven't seen a peace agreement between South Korea and North Korea for 6 years. or 70 years even. And South Korea is doing quite well. So this is a possibility, like having a stopping or fading out of the fighting, and maybe a start of negotiations, which may last very long or endlessly. You know, this is a possibility, and Ukrainians actually, for them, it would be okay at this point to have to see an end of the fighting.
Okay.
And of course, there's this argument, and it's hard to debate, or it's hard to negate this argument that even if fighting stops now, nobody can say that Putin in 5 years or in 7 years won't attack again.
Right.
So this is a real problem. An answer to that could be that Ukraine is becoming something like Israel. You know, I've heard this. It's called the porcupine theory. You know, like it's so Stachelschwein-Theorie, porcupine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, porcupine, exactly.
So its military is so strong that Russia won't attack it again. This could be a solution, and I at the moment I mean I'm really actually waiting for the politicians of this world to find some creative solutions. There's also a lot of talking about certain countries like India or Qatar or Saudi Arabia who could become intermediators between the conflict parties. There are certain signs, for example, as we've read in the Financial Times some 2 or 3 days ago, there were negotiations in the summer, and actually they were about to meet in persona in Qatar, the Russians and the Ukrainians, to stop strikes on the energy infrastructure. So Russia would stop its strikes on Ukraine on the energy infrastructure, and Ukraine would stop its attacks with drones on oil refineries and so on. So actually, there are some signs that hint towards one could call it a slow fading out of the fighting. You know, there could be a situation where these attacks start.
Yeah.
This could allow Ukraine to somehow get back to a more normal life.
Yeah.
Like airports opening, investments coming in, whatever, and the next step could be fading out of the fighting on the front line.
I'll come back to that in just a moment, because I would like to talk to you about plans for reconstruction and what that could look like. But first, there's a point that one of our viewers made, sort of picking up on your comment that Ukrainians might be willing to accept some sort of compromise. And the viewer is wondering whether increased support from the West, from NATO, to Ukraine would, on the one hand, either help bring about an end to the war, or that sort of fading out that you were talking about, or would it just prolong the war even longer by having this Western support? And the viewer goes on to then say, did the West's position since 2014 on Ukraine help give Putin the excuse he was looking for to invade?
Okay, starting with your second question, I would say that the handling of the Ukraine issue by the West since 2014 was very cautious.
Mhm.
I mean, we didn't see any great, I don't know, initiative like inviting Ukraine to NATO or really strengthening their military in a serious way. We didn't see this. So I would rather say that Putin, since 2014, was thinking of revenge
Mhm.
for what happened on the Maidan.
Mhm.
I think this was the Maidan and the victory of the Ukrainians and of the, let's say, pro-Western, but not only pro-Western, it was the civil society, the victory of the civil society against a president who was financed by Russia, who should have been totally loyal towards Russia. That was the worst, one of the worst moments for Putin, I
Mhm.
think. And that's why
Mhm.
since 2014 he was thinking about revenge for this.
So it's
So,
interesting. It's interesting that you say that because in 2023, I was at the Munich Security Conference and I was speaking with a couple of Bundestag members, members of the German Parliament from different parties, and we were talking about Ukraine. And there was a gentleman who was sort of listening to our conversation, and he moved his chair closer. And it turned out that he was a Ukrainian journalist who was working for Deutsche Welle, and he said, you in the West are naive. You're looking at each isolated or each incident since 2014 as an isolated event. You're not looking at it as a whole. You're not taking Putin or Russia seriously. And it took the invasion in 2022 for you to take it seriously, but the signs have been there all along. And I thought that that was a very interesting and useful assessment, particularly for the parliamentarians that I was talking about, because in many senses, these little incidents, these little irritations that happened along the way were not something that was seen as part of a bigger puzzle.
okay, but you can, there are signs, but you can interpret signs
Yeah, in
in a
different
different
ways.
way. And also, I don't think that like in 2014, the road towards a war, a full-scale war in 2020 was like
Clear.
direct.
Yeah.
There were still moments where it could have been possible to avoid this war. I don't want to go into the details, but I mean, there was a moment in 2019 when Zelensky came to power where he was ready for a compromise that his predecessor, Poroshenko, wasn't ready for. And basically, Zelensky came to power with the devise of bringing peace
Yeah.
and talking to Putin and somehow doing it in a pragmatic way. And he was elected for this.
Hmm.
But there was a radical segment in Ukrainian society who stopped Zelensky on his way.
Yeah.
So there were demonstrations against him when he did his first very cautious steps towards, at least towards dialogue, you know? So, yeah. So what I'm saying is that, yes, Putin wanted revenge, but still the road to this full-scale war wasn't without alternatives. Let's
Hmm.
put it like that.
So as
And
we look
coming,
to, yeah, yeah. No, I was just going to say, as we look to the future, I'd like to come back to that other part of the question of whether greater Western support or NATO support to Ukraine could bring an end to the war or whether it would prolong the war.
Mhm. I would say that it's crucial uh, for the solution of this conflict that there is a prospect for Ukraine of stable and continuous support, financial support, and military support, because this should send the signal to Putin
Yeah.
that no matter who is elected in the US or in Germany, our support for Ukraine will continue.
Yeah.
And this, in the end, may be connected with, I don't know, with the delivery of certain weapons that will put pressure on Russia or Putin or on his military, connected with diplomatic initiatives. Maybe this will bring Putin, this is my hope, to an understanding that the price of continuing the war is too high, or is higher than the advantage that he gets from it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, because so in Germany, in this discussion, you know, we have this Wagenknecht politicians from that side who are basically saying that we have to stop giving weapons to Ukraine. We need negotiations. No, like giving support, continuous and stable support to Ukraine is maybe the most important precondition for having meaningful negotiations.
Yeah.
Because I mean, now at this point, the position of Ukraine is quite weak. Of like, if it will start negotiations at this point, and it's that's why, like, this is the signaling of stable support for Ukraine would at least give them a little better position for these negotiations. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, you know, related to that and related to what you just said, another viewer is curious how, I mean, Ukrainians view the potential outcomes of the US election next week. Obviously, the US election is being watched very closely around the world. I'm sure that Putin is watching it closely as well. But how is the election being followed in Ukraine, and what do people think about whether it's a President Trump or a President Harris?
Of course, they see Trump as an unpredictable factor, while they see the Biden administration and Harris as a friend of Ukraine.
Yeah.
They understand, but they are also realistic concerning them. You know, I mean, they've seen over the first half of this year that America, because of this blockade in the Congress, wouldn't deliver weapons to Ukraine. So they have seen the constraints of this support of the US and the limitations. So in some sense, they understand that if Harris is elected, basically the politics won't change radically towards Ukraine. But this also doesn't give a lot of hope. Right. Because it means that the support for Ukraine will stay on the same level, and which doesn't bring a solution of this war any nearer. So there are some in Ukraine who say that maybe Trump could be, in some sense, a game changer.
I mean, put it this way, if people are more open to a compromise in order for the fighting to end, and Trump talks about ending the war in a day or in a phone call, there could be a sense that something could change. The question that I have is sort of what sort of leverage does he have with either side in order to bring this to such a speedy end?
I mean, I'm just fantasizing at the moment, but let's say Putin wants to support Trump because he sees him as an, I don't know, as an ally,
Mhm.
then one could imagine that Putin is more open towards negotiations with Trump than he is with Biden or Harris.
Yeah,
But this is just theory.
yeah,
I don't know. But it could be possible. No, nobody
yeah.
knows. Of course, now everybody in Russia and in Ukraine is waiting for the results of these elections and hoping that there will be some window of opportunity after them.
Mhm. One viewer just submitted a question that ties in with this, which is if U.S. support for Ukraine stops or is significantly reduced, what do you think Europe will do? How will the EU react?
Um, well, as it's hard to say. Of course, everybody was saying over the last year that in this case, Europe would ramp up its production of weapons, ammunition, and so on. But we all understand that this is very limited. It's
Mhm.
better than in 23. The ramping up already basically took place over the last year, but still it's hard to imagine that Europe can somehow substitute US support. But I mean, we could also imagine a situation where Europe would just buy the weapons from the Americans and give them to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, yeah,
So this is
that's an option
possible.
as
This is
well.
possible, but as you see in Germany, for example, at the moment, I mean, the support for Ukraine is still high among Germans,
Yeah.
but there's also a very high percentage at the same time of Germans who want the war to end,
Mhm.
who ask for some kind of political solution of
Yeah.
this war, and it will be hard to sell in Germany, taking into account the economic situation, that Germany has to give even more money
Mhm.
or weapons for Ukraine. So
Especially when you consider the fact that even more money will be required when we get into the reconstruction phase. And there's been some discussion about how much US participation there would be in paying for reconstruction, and sort of a sense that that needs to lie more with Europe. You and I had a chance to sort of touch on this before we went live, but I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts on when reconstruction should start. Right? There seems as if there are two schools of thought. One says reconstruction can really only start after the fighting stops, and once there's a ceasefire. Others say it's important to start the reconstruction right away, to give sort of a stronger sense of hope, but also because we don't know how long this conflict will continue. Um, what is your thinking on the reconstruction process and what the biggest priorities are and when to start with them?
hmm. Well, actually, the situation is very different in Ukraine if you compare the Donbas in the east
Mhm.
with the western regions next to Poland or Hungary or Slovakia. You have like a big boom in construction of apartment buildings, factories, whatever, in the west of the country. And there are not so many Western investors, but there are, I know, because in that part of the country, it's quite safe to build
Mhm.
something, and there are good opportunities to do so. And also, many Ukrainian businessmen are taking their factories from the east to the west or to more central part of Ukraine. Um, so basically, the reconstruction is taking place already. What I hear all the and I mean, if you take cities in the east, big cities like Kharkiv, or in the south like Zaporizhia, or the smaller cities in the Donbas. I mean, at this point, it's really hard to talk about reconstruction because these cities are under constant rocket attacks and drone attacks by the Russians. And of course, there is some reconstruction of infrastructure, electricity grid, and so on. But this is basically mostly repairing the stuff that is being damaged. So doing reconstruction there at this point is no, it's more about repairing than reconstruction. But concerning other parts of the countries, there are many opportunities. And I mean, what I talk to Ukrainian people from the energy sector and from the agricultural sector, what they are saying is, we are ready, we have the money, we are ready to do it ourselves, but we need war insurances for the stuff that we are building. We also invite Western investors and so on, but we need these kind of guarantees, war insurances, because otherwise it will be very hard to invest if you know that it could be hit by a Russian rocket the next day.
And I guess that's part of the question is sort of what role should foreign investment play in that, and how much should be domestic investment?
I would say that Western investors are very cautious at this moment because I mean, why should they invest in a country that's under attack by Russian missiles every day?
This is true.
You better invest your money in other places. I mean, businessmen are not politicians. They want their profits, and that's normal. So Western investors, I think they will start to invest in Ukraine only after at least a ceasefire.
Moritz, as we start to sort of wrap up, I have one, maybe two questions that are sort of bigger picture and where I'd like you to take a step back for a moment. And I guess the first of those questions would be, you know, as you reflect on your long experience reporting on the post-Soviet space and your long experience reporting on conflict in Ukraine, not just since 2022, but since 2014, what do you think the most important thing is for the world or for the transatlantic community to know and understand about this conflict?
I would say what I also had to learn, because I was looking at Ukraine for quite a long time from a Moscow perspective. I was living in Russia, as most correspondents, like correspondents who were reporting on Ukraine, they were coming from Moscow mainly. So I had to change this perspective. I mean, before 2012 or 13, I also looked at the Ukrainians as basically Russians, or not Russians, but as people who have their own language, which is very similar with Russian, and basically they are a very, very similar culture, which is in fact true. But I mean, what the Ukrainians taught us in 2014 and even more in 22 is that they have a much stronger sense of resistance, and they are ready to risk their own lives for a common cause and for the cause of freedom and democracy. I mean, 2014 wasn't the first revolution in Ukraine. They had one in the 90s and one in 2006, 2005, 2006. In this sense, they are different from the Russians at least from the Russians that we see over the last 25 years. Because in Russia, I've lived there for several years, and I mean, this let's say deal that Putin proposed to the Russians, it worked and it works until now. And the deal is stay out of politics and live your life, earn your money, buy cars, buy jewels, go to Turkey, Europe, US, Thailand, wherever, live your life, but stay out of politics. And unfortunately, it works until now. But this didn't work in Ukraine. Although in Ukraine in 2014, this Yanukovych, the president back then, he basically tried to build a system like in Russia, but that didn't work out in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the main difference between Ukrainians and Russians is not, maybe not in the language. You have a lot of Ukrainians who speak Russian, you know.
Yeah.
It's not the language, but it's this sense of hey, this is unjust. There's someone is taking over our country. Someone is behaving badly. Let's do a revolution. And in Russia, there are people who think like that, but it's always a great minority.
Yeah.
That's why also we didn't see in 22 there were some protests. I was hoping really for a lot more people to get out on the streets, but unfortunately we didn't see it.
Yeah, we haven't seen that, not at all. You know, you sort of answered this last question with your previous response when you said it sort of took some time to get to know Ukraine because you had been looking at Ukraine through a Russian lens. But you know, I was thinking, you know, as a closing question, it would be very interesting to hear from you what has been one of the most surprising or unexpected experiences that you've had since you've been reporting on Ukraine and on this conflict in Ukraine?
Hard to say.
I mean, it's been interesting.
Maybe the most striking experience was or is that at the same time, while a really horrendous war is going on the front line, people are dying in the trenches, and at the same time, there is so much normal life going on in Ukraine. You know, I mean, last winter, I remember going to a techno club in Kiev, and I just came back from Donbass, where you had where you had a scenario like I don't know, Second World War, you know.
Yeah.
And then you go to this electro club in Kiev, and this contrast is maybe the most striking that
I mean, I
saw
think
in the
that's
last years.
Yeah, that's certainly something that's come up, you know, both in the article that I've referred to, but also in our conversation, sort of the juxtaposition of these two extremes in a couple of different cases must be quite jarring, right? Because this is all playing out in the same country, which is a country at war and a country under attack, even if in Kyiv, the attack feels like it's very far away.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that I'm having this experience much more than when I travel through the country as a reporter from the outside than people who are living their everyday life. You know, like everybody is sort of adapting to the circumstances he's living in. And it's only me who is traveling from the front line to Kiev, wherever, and I see this contrast much sharper than many people see it in their everyday life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Moritz, Herzlichen Dank. This has been a fascinating conversation, and it's really been wonderful to get your insights into what's actually happening sort of behind the scenes and away from the headlines in Ukraine. I wish you well as you continue this work, and I'd be delighted to have another conversation again after one of your next trips to Ukraine. Sadly, this is a problem that I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon. I guess my biggest concern is that it will turn into a hot, cold conflict, frozen conflict, a hot, frozen conflict, because it will sort of move into sort of the periphery for a lot of people, but the fighting will continue on the ground. And I think we need to keep the awareness on the fact that this conflict is still ongoing.
Yeah, let's stay in touch.
We will definitely stay in touch. Many, many thanks. And thanks again for your reporting and for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.